The first scream did not come from the streets. It came from a radio. A sharp, broken voice cut through morning music, stuttering with disbelief, and emergency alert unfinished sentences tumbling over one another. Something had gone wrong at the city zoo. Security breach. Large animal escape. Citizens were advised to stay indoors. For a few seconds, the city did nothing. Traffic lights kept blinking. Coffee machines kept hissing. People glanced at their phones, frowned, and returned to their routines. Cities are trained to ignore fear until it becomes unavoidable. Then the second sound arrived. A deep, rolling roar echoed between concrete buildings, low enough to be felt in the chest before it was fully heard. Windows rattled, birds scattered. Somewhere a car alarm went off and did not stop. That was when shock turned into panic. Social media flooded instantly, feeds filling with shaky videos and half-formed sentences. A massive dark shape moving through a service road. Police vehicles skidding into position. A crowd screaming and running in opposite directions. The word gorilla appeared again and again, each time accompanied by disbelief, as if repeating it might make it less real. It did not. Within minutes, downtown streets were empty. Storefronts slammed shut. Parents dragged children into doorways. Sirens howled from every direction, overlapping until they became a single unbearable sound. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades chopping the air like a warning. No one knew exactly where the gorilla was, only where it had been. Every new update contradicted the last. He was near the river, no near the old library, no closer to the cemetery on 8th Street. Each rumor carried its own wave of terror, pushing fear outward like ripples in water. The city had never practiced for this. Police lines formed hastily, officers gripping weapons with hands that betrayed their nerves. Some shouted commands to no one in particular. Others stood frozen, staring down streets that suddenly felt too narrow, too fragile to contain something so powerful. The unspoken truth hung in the air. If the gorilla charged, there would be no time to think, only to react. And reaction, everyone knew, would mean gunfire. News vans arrived next, broadcasting the chaos live. Anchors spoke with voices carefully balanced between calm and catastrophe. Words like dangerous, unpredictable, and public safety threat filled the airwaves. Each label stripped the animal of context, reducing him to a problem that needed to be solved quickly. Very few people asked how he felt. Witnesses described him in fragments. A massive silhouette against the morning fog. Long arms knuckle-walking with surprising quiet. Eyes that did not dart or panic, but scanned slowly, deliberately. This detail unsettled people more than the size. Panic was understandable. Calm was not. By mid-morning, the city was holding its breath. Schools went into lockdown. Office buildings sealed their doors. Emergency alerts buzzed phones so often that batteries began to die. Every shadow looked like movement. Every distant sound sent hearts racing. And then on the edge of the evacuation zone, someone did something no one expected. An elderly woman stepped out into the open. She emerged from between two brick buildings near the old cemetery, walking slowly, guided by a white cane, tapping softly against the pavement. Her hair was silver, her back slightly bent, her steps measured and unhurried. She did not run. She did not shout. She did not look around in confusion like the others had. She simply walked forward. People screamed at her from windows. Someone yelled her name, though no one was sure who she was. A police officer broke formation, shouting for her to stop, to turn back, to get down. His voice cracked with urgency. She did not. From a distance, she looked fragile, impossibly small against the empty street. A figure that did not belong in a city under siege. The contrast was almost painful. A woman who had lived long enough to move without hurry, stepping into a moment defined entirely by fear. And somewhere nearby, unseen but very real, the gorilla was still there. The air felt heavier then, as if the city itself understood what was about to happen. Cameras zoomed in. Police fingers tightened on triggers. The word "shoot" passed silently between officers without being spoken. No one knew why the woman was there. Some assumed she was confused, unaware of the danger. Others whispered that shock had made her freeze. But there was something about the way she stood upright, steady facing forward, that made those explanations feel wrong. She wasn't lost. She was waiting. The city had reached the edge of its fear, a moment where chaos could tip into tragedy with a single movement. Every siren fell silent, as if the world itself had paused to watch. Shock had given way to panic. Panic had settled into a thick, suffocating dread. And now, standing between armed officers and an unseen animal, was a woman who refused to move while the city waited to discover whether fear or something else would decide what came next. No one understood her at first. From behind barricades and half-closed doors, people watched the elderly woman, standing alone in the open street, her white cane resting lightly against the ground, as if it were nothing more than an ordinary morning walk. The contrast was unsettling. Everything around her screamed urgency, police shouting into radios, helicopters, circling red and blue lights slicing through the gray air, yet she remained still, almost serene. Surprise was the first emotion that spread through the crowd. Why wasn't she running? An officer stepped forward again, his voice louder, now edged with panic. He told her to get down, to move back, to do anything except remain where she was. His words bounced off the buildings and dissolved into the heavy silence that followed. She turned her head slightly toward the sound, as though acknowledging it, but she did not move her feet. It was then that people began to notice the details. Her hands were steady, not clenched, not shaking. Her shoulders were relaxed, not hunched in fear. She did not scan the street wildly the way someone confused might. Instead, her face was angled forward, chin lifted just enough to suggest attention rather than defiance. Confusion replaced shock. Some whispered that she must not understand what was happening, that she was blind, that she could not see the danger rushing toward her. Others argued the opposite, that perhaps she understood more than anyone else there. Phones zoomed in on her face, trying to capture an expression that would explain the moment. But her features offered no easy answers. She looked calm. That calmness made people uneasy. A woman watching from a nearby apartment pressed her hand to the glass and whispered, "Someone help her." A man beside her shook his head slowly, as if the situation had slipped beyond anything help could fix. The crowd's fear was no longer just for themselves. It had narrowed, sharpened, and focused entirely on the solitary figure in the street. Who was she? As the seconds stretched, fragments of her story began to surface, pieced together by neighbors, bystanders, and half-remembered conversations. Her name was Margaret Hale. She was 78 years old. She had lived in that neighborhood for decades, long enough to know the sound of the city when it was alive and when it was afraid. And yes, she was blind. But blindness, as it turned out, did not mean ignorance. Margaret had heard the sirens. She had heard the helicopters. She had heard the panic in the voices outside her apartment window. She knew something terrible was unfolding. When the emergency alert crackled through her radio, she did not panic the way others did. Instead, she listened carefully, her head tilted, absorbing every word. And then she had done something that made no sense to anyone else. She had picked up her cane and walked outside. Those who knew her well enough said this was not stubbornness. Margaret was not reckless. She had survived wars, personal losses, and illnesses that had slowly taken her sight but sharpened her other senses. She understood danger. She respected it. But she also understood something else, something quieter. Silence. She had felt it before. The kind of silence that settles when fear becomes so loud it drowns out everything else. Standing in her apartment, she had sensed that the city was no longer listening, only reacting. And that to her was more frightening than any escaped animal. As she stood in the street, now confusion deepened into curiosity among those watching. Why was she facing forward? Margaret's breathing was slow, deliberate. She listened not just to the chaos behind her, but to the space ahead. To the subtle sounds most people had stopped noticing, the echo of her cane on asphalt, the faint rustle of leaves, the distant but unmistakable presence of something large moving with surprising restraint. She could not see the gorilla, but she could feel him. Years earlier, long before the city had changed and the zoo had expanded, Margaret had volunteered there. Back when her vision was fading but not yet gone, she had spent afternoons sitting near enclosures, listening to the animals, learning their rhythms. She had learned that not all danger announced itself with noise. Sometimes the most powerful creatures were the quietest when they were uncertain. That memory stirred now, unbidden, but vivid. Margaret did not step forward because she was brave in the way people like to label courage. She stepped forward because standing still felt honest, because running without knowing where or why felt wrong, because something deep in her told her that fear, when met with more fear, only multiplies. Still, doubt crept in. Her heart beat faster now, not with terror, but with awareness. She knew she was vulnerable. She knew she could not defend herself if things went wrong. That knowledge did not paralyze her, it grounded her. Every breath became intentional. Every sound mattered. Behind her, the police had stopped shouting. They were watching now. Officers exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering across faces trained for clear threats and clear commands. This situation offered neither. A blind elderly woman standing calmly in front of a potential lethal confrontation was not part of any protocol. "What is she doing?" someone muttered into a radio. No one answered. Curiosity began to edge into the fear, unsettling in its own way. People leaned forward not just to see what the gorilla might do, but to understand what Margaret was doing. Cameras stayed fixed on her, as if she were the key to what happened next. Margaret shifted her weight slightly, adjusting her stance. Her cane tapped once more, a soft rhythmic sound that cut through the tension. She spoke then, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a voice shaped by years of being heard without being seen. "It's all right," she said. No one knew who she was speaking to. Some assumed she was talking to the officers. Others thought the words were meant for herself. But the direction of her voice, steady forward-facing, suggested something else entirely. Concern flared again. Someone screamed for her to stop talking, as if words themselves might provoke disaster. But Margaret did not raise her voice. She did not repeat herself. She simply waited. Curiosity and worry tangled together, now tightening in the chests of everyone watching. What did she expect to happen? What could possibly come from this fragile, quiet stand against something so powerful and unknown? The city had been holding its breath since the sirens began. Now it held it for her. Margaret Hale. The woman who didn't run stood at the center of the city's fear, not because she lacked it, but because she chose not to let it decide her next step. And somewhere ahead of her, unseen but very real, another presence was listening too. The distance between them closed without warning. One moment the street felt empty ahead of Margaret Hale, wide, echoing, undefined. The next, the air itself seemed to compress. It was not a sound she heard first, but a weight she felt, as if the space in front of her had suddenly become occupied by something immense and deliberate. Her breath caught, not in panic, but in recognition. 400 pounds of muscle and instinct had stopped less than 10 feet away from her. For those watching from behind barriers and armored vehicles, the moment was unbearable. The gorilla emerged fully into view now, no longer a rumor carried by sirens and radio chatter, but a towering, undeniable presence. His massive shoulders rose and fell with slow breaths. His arms, longer than Margaret's entire body, hung heavy at his sides. Every movement carried a terrifying economy, as though energy itself was something he conserved. No one moved. This was the moment everyone had feared, the instant when raw power and fragile humanity would finally collide. Margaret did not step back. She could sense him clearly now. The subtle vibration in the ground beneath her shoes, the faint sound of breath moving through a chest far larger than her own. The smell, earthy, animal, not unpleasant, but unmistakably alive. Her cane hovered just above the pavement, forgotten. She was face to face with something that could end her life in seconds. And yet something unexpected happened inside her. The fear did not explode. It did not consume her. Instead, it sharpened her awareness until everything else fell away. She felt very small, but not helpless. Very old, but not weak. Her spine straightened slightly, not in defiance, but in presence. Across from her, the gorilla stopped completely. His name, known to the zookeepers and scientists watching the monitors, was Atlas, a silverback bred in captivity, raised under human observation, conditioned to routines and boundaries that had shattered the moment the enclosure failed. He should have been panicked. He should have been aggressive. Instead, he stared. Atlas's dark eyes locked onto the still figure before him. He tilted his head just slightly, a gesture so subtle most people missed it. To the experts, that single movement was chilling. It was not the posture of an animal preparing to charge. It was the posture of an animal assessing. Margaret felt the shift too. She raised her free hand slowly, not toward him, not away, but open at her side. The motion was small, unthreatening, guided more by instinct than intention. Somewhere deep inside her, a memory stirred, the advice an old handler had once given her decades ago. Animals feel tension before they understand it. She softened her shoulders. She let her breathing slow until it matched the steady rhythm she sensed in front of her. She did not speak his name, she did not know it. She did not know what he was thinking. She only knew that whatever happened next would depend less on strength and more on restraint. The crowd watching struggled to understand what they were seeing. The gorilla did not roar. He did not beat his chest. He did not advance. He lowered his massive head slightly, bringing his line of sight closer to Margaret's level. The gesture was intimate in a way that felt almost invasive. A single step from him would close the distance entirely. Margaret swallowed. For the first time, doubt brushed against her resolve. She was acutely aware of her vulnerability now. The fragility of her bones, the thinness of her skin, the fact that no amount of calm could stop nature if it decided otherwise. But Atlas did not move. Instead, he inhaled deeply, then exhaled a slow, controlled breath that sent a ripple through the air between them. Dust lifted from the street. Margaret felt it against her face. She smiled, not because she felt safe, not because she believed everything would be all right. She smiled because something about that breath told her this moment was not about dominance or fear. It was about recognition. Atlas took one cautious step closer. A collective gasp tore through the crowd. Fingers tightened on triggers. Orders were whispered, then silenced again. The distance between gorilla and woman was now so small, it felt obscene that the world had ever allowed them to be separated by steel and glass. Margaret's heart pounded, but her feet stayed rooted. She tilted her head slightly upward, orienting herself toward the sound of his breathing. "Easy," she murmured, not as a command but as a shared thought spoken aloud. The word hung in the air. Atlas paused mid-step. His fingers flexed against the pavement nails, scraping softly against stone. The sound was quiet, almost delicate, and yet it carried a power that made the hairs on every onlooker's arms stand up. Experts later debated what happened in that pause. Some said Atlas was confused by her lack of fear. Others argued that her blindness altered the dynamic. She was not responding with the visual cues he expected. But those explanations felt incomplete. They failed to capture the subtle exchange happening in the space between them. Margaret was not looking at him as an object to be feared. She was simply there. Atlas leaned forward just enough for his shadow to fall over her completely. Margaret felt the warmth of his body, the faint vibration of his muscles holding themselves in check. It was overwhelming and strangely precise, as if he were measuring himself carefully. She resisted the urge to step back. That choice, small, quiet, and visible, changed everything. Because Atlas did not close the distance any further. He lowered himself instead. Slowly, deliberately, the massive silverback bent at the knees and settled onto the pavement, his bulk folding into itself with a grace that contradicted his size. The movement was not submissive. It was controlled, intentional. His eyes never left Margaret. The street fell into stunned silence. 400 pounds of power had chosen stillness. Margaret exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath. Her hand trembled slightly now, not with fear, but with the release of it. She let it rest against her cane, grounding herself again. She could sense the change immediately. The tension in the air eased just a fraction. The pressure lifted from her chest. Whatever threshold they had approached together, they had not crossed it. Atlas sat quietly, his presence immense, but no longer threatening. His chest rose and fell. His gaze softened, though it remained intent. This was not curiosity alone. It was something deeper, something closer to attention. For the first time since the escape began, no one expected violence. Margaret stood face to face with raw strength given form, and the world watched as neither side claimed victory. There was no heroism in the traditional sense, no dramatic gesture, only a shared pause that felt heavier than any action. In that pause, fear did not vanish, but it changed shape. It became awe. Because what stood between the blind elderly woman and the silverback gorilla was not chaos or control, but a fragile, extraordinary balance. One breath, one step, one choice away from disaster, yet somehow holding steady. And everyone watching knew with chilling clarity that whatever happened next would redefine everything they thought they understood about power, instinct, and trust. The moment did not announce itself. There was no sudden movement, no dramatic sound to warn the crowd that something irreversible was about to happen. If anything, it arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, slipping into the space between two breaths. Atlas was still seated on the pavement, his massive frame folded inward. his presence no longer advancing, yet impossible to ignore. Margaret Hale stood exactly where she had been. Her cane grounded her posture, calm but alert. The distance between them had not changed, but the air around them had. Something shifted. Those trained to watch animals felt it first. The handlers behind the barriers exchanged glances without speaking. The tension they had been bracing against the expectation of explosion of chaos did not come. Instead, it thinned as if the situation had quietly rewritten its own rules. Atlas blinked. It was a small detail, a reflex perhaps, but it broke the stillness in a way nothing else could. His eyes closed briefly, then opened again, slower, this time softer. His breathing deepened, becoming more rhythmic, less guarded. Margaret sensed it immediately. She could not see the change, but she felt it in the way the ground seemed to settle beneath her feet, in the absence of that sharp, coiled tension she had been holding against. Her shoulders relaxed by a fraction. Her fingers loosened their grip on the cane. She did not smile this time. Instead, she spoke. Her voice was low, almost conversational, as though addressing someone seated across a table, rather than a creature capable of ending her life in a heartbeat. "It's all right," she said gently. Not loudly, not for anyone else, just enough for the space between them to carry it. Atlas's head tilted again. The sound reached him not as a command, not as a threat, but as a steady vibration, carried on breath and intention. His ears shifted subtly, angling toward her voice. This time the reaction was unmistakable. He understood that this sound mattered. The crowd reacted before the authorities did. People leaned forward to spite themselves. Some raised phones, then lowered them, uncertain whether capturing the moment felt appropriate anymore. A woman near the barricade covered her mouth, tears forming without warning. Others stood frozen, unable to look away. Atlas moved, not forward. He lifted one enormous hand and placed it flat against the ground, between himself and Margaret. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. His fingers spread, pressing into the pavement as though testing its reality. The gesture was not aggressive, it was grounding. Margaret felt the vibration travel up through the soles of her shoes. Her breath caught not in fear, but in understanding. She took a small step forward. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted a warning that was immediately swallowed by the collective shock. Officers stiffened, weapons half raised again, then hesitated. Everything balanced on the edge of that single step. Margaret stopped well before reaching him. She did not invade his space. She simply reduced the distance, closing it just enough to change the equation. "I'm here," she said quietly. The words were not meant to reassure him. They were meant to state a fact. Atlas lowered his head further, bringing his massive face closer to the ground. His eyes never left her. For the first time, those watching noticed something profoundly unsettling and deeply moving. He was not watching her body. He was listening. Margaret spoke again, her voice steady now, warmed by something that felt dangerously close to trust. She spoke of nothing important, of the weather, of the way the city sounded different when fear passed through it, of how loud the world could become when no one listened. Her words did not matter. Her tone did. Atlas responded in the only language he had. He exhaled longer this time, deeper. The breath rolled outward, stirring dust, and carrying with it a sound so low it vibrated rather than echoed. It was not a growl. It was not a warning. It was release. That was the moment everything changed. The silverback shifted his weight and turned his body slightly, not away from Margaret, but sideways. The movement opened his chest, exposing his vulnerable flank. To those who understood guerrilla behavior, the significance was immediate and staggering. This was not submission, it was trust. Margaret felt the change like a door opening. The pressure in the air eased further. The invisible line everyone feared crossing dissolved, not because it vanished, but because it no longer needed guarding. She took another step forward, then stopped. She did not reach out. She did not need to. Atlas closed his eyes again, longer this time, and lowered his head until his chin nearly touched the ground. His posture softened completely, his massive frame settling into stillness so absolute it felt deliberate, chosen. Margaret's chest tightened. She had lived long enough to recognize moments that did not belong to time. Moments that existed outside of explanation, where instinct and intention intersected without permission. This was one of them. Behind the barricades, command radios crackled with confusion. Orders were delayed, questioned, abandoned. No one wanted to be the person who broke this moment by force. Atlas remained motionless. Margaret shifted her weight slightly and, with careful intention, lowered herself onto the edge of a nearby curb. The movement was slow, deliberate, mirroring his own earlier choice to sit. She placed her cane across her lap and folded her hands. Two beings so different in form, history, and power now occupied the same level of the world. Eye to eye, breath to breath. Time seemed to stretch, then blur. In that shared stillness, something irreversible took root. The situation was no longer about containment or escape. It was no longer about fear or spectacle. It was about a decision. Atlas could have risen at any moment. Margaret could have retreated. The authorities could have intervened. But no one did, because everyone felt it. The danger had not disappeared, but it had transformed. When Atlas finally opened his eyes again, they were no longer searching. They were settled. He studied Margaret one last time, then shifted his gaze toward the street beyond her, toward the sound of distant sirens and waiting crowds. He understood where he was. He understood what he had chosen. Slowly, with a grace that contradicted every expectation, Atlas rose to his full height, not toward Margaret, but away from her. He turned his body completely now, placing himself between her and the chaos beyond. The message was unmistakable. Margaret felt tears slip down her face, uninvited and unstoppable. The moment everything changed was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was a choice made without words, without force, without witnesses who could fully explain it. And in that choice, the world saw something it was never prepared to see. Not the power of a gorilla, but the restraint of one, and the quiet courage of a woman who refused to let fear define the ending. No one realized the truth at first. In the hours after Atlas was safely contained again, guided calmly, almost willingly, back into a secured enclosure, the city tried to explain what it had just witnessed, using the only tools it had: headlines, speculation, shaky phone videos, and urgent expert commentary. News anchors spoke of anomalous animal behavior. Analysts debated stress responses, misfired instincts, or the possibility of sedation still lingering in his system. Social media split itself cleanly down, the middle half calling it a miracle, half insisting it was coincidence. But the truth did not live in any of those explanations. It surfaced quietly days later when the noise had faded, and only the people who had been closest to the moment were still asking the right questions. Margaret Hale was the first. She sat at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug she had forgotten to drink from listening to a wildlife liaison gently explain the official findings. Atlas had not been sedated at the time of the encounter. There was no neurological anomaly, no evidence of confusion or impairment. In fact, all indicators suggested heightened awareness. He knew exactly where he was, the woman said softly, and what he was doing. Margaret closed her eyes. That was what she had felt. The liaison hesitated before continuing. There's something else, something that didn't come up until we reviewed older records. The name Atlas had not always been Atlas. 32 years earlier, he had been known by a different designation, one no longer used in public-facing documents. As a juvenile, he had been housed temporarily at a smaller conservation facility after being orphaned during an illegal wildlife transfer. Records from that time were sparse, many handwritten, many lost. But one name appeared more than once: Margaret Hale. She had volunteered there briefly in her early 40s, during a period of her life she rarely spoke about now. A time marked by grief, by the loss of her husband, by days that blurred together until purpose became something she had to rebuild piece by piece. She had worked mostly with children and outreach programs, and sometimes with animals that needed quiet more than care. Atlas had been one of them, a young gorilla withdrawn and watchful who reacted poorly to loud voices and sudden movement. Margaret remembered sitting outside his enclosure after hours, speaking softly while keeping her distance. She remembered reading aloud, not to teach, not to train, but simply to be present. She never touched him, never entered his space. She had thought it hadn't mattered. The records confirmed otherwise. Atlas's early behavioral markers showed a distinct response to her voice: lower stress indicators, increased calm, a pattern that faded after he was transferred to a larger facility and eventually renamed. But memory, it seemed, had not faded the same way. Experts were careful with their language. Gorillas, they explain, do not remember in the way humans do, not in narratives or faces, but in emotional imprints, sound patterns, cadence, presence associated with safety. Margaret's voice had been one of those imprints. The truth settled over the city slowly, uneasily. What Atlas had responded to that day was not heroism, not fearlessness, not even trust in humanity. It was recognition, not of a person, but of a feeling. Margaret had not stood still because she was brave. She had stood still because something in her knew long before logic caught up that she was not facing a stranger, that the calm she felt was not defiance, but familiarity resurfacing after decades. The city began to reframe the story. What had first been framed as a near tragedy became something more unsettling and more profound. Not a tale of danger narrowly avoided, but of connection enduring beyond time, memory, and expectation. Margaret declined interviews. She did not want to become a symbol. She did not want Atlas to become one either. When asked how she felt knowing he remembered her, she answered simply, "I don't think he remembered me. I think he remembered what it felt like not to be alone." Atlas's behavior after the incident reinforced that truth. He was calmer, more observant. He positioned himself differently within his enclosure, often near the area where visitors spoke softly rather than loudly. Caretakers noticed he responded to gentle tones, retreating from sharp noises. He had not changed who he was, but something had been unlocked. Not obedience, understanding. The truth no one expected was not about animals possessing human emotions. It was about humans underestimating the depth of animal experience. For decades, the line between instinct and empathy had been drawn too boldly, too confidently. What happened between Atlas and Margaret challenged that line, not by erasing it, but by blurring it in ways science was only beginning to articulate. Margaret returned to her routines, morning walks, evening radio programs. The quiet life she had built remained unchanged on the surface, but something within her had settled. She no longer wondered whether her small acts in the past had mattered. They had, not because they led to a moment captured on camera, but because they had shaped a memory strong enough to surface when everything else fell away. Atlas returned to his life as well. He did not seek attention. He did not repeat the behavior. What he had done did not need repeating. It had already said everything. The truth in the end was not dramatic, it was humbling. That kindness does not disappear simply because it goes unnoticed. That presence leaves marks deeper than touch. That memory in its purest form is not about recalling faces, but about recognizing safety when it returns. And perhaps most unsettling of all, that the world we share is filled with beings who are always listening, always remembering, even when we assume they are not. What happened that day stunned everyone, not because it was extraordinary, but because it revealed something we had been overlooking all along. In the end, this story was never really about danger. It wasn't about an escaped gorilla, a city in panic, or a moment caught on shaky phone cameras. Those were only the surface details, the noise that drew our attention. What stayed behind long after the barricades were removed and the headlines faded was something quieter and far more unsettling. It was about memory. Not the kind we store in words or photographs, but the kind that lives deeper, shaped by tone, patience, and the way someone once chose not to be a threat. Margaret Hale did not save Atlas with strength or strategy. She did not calm him with commands or gestures. She simply stood as she always had decades before present, steady and unafraid to offer calm without asking for anything in return. And Atlas responded not as an animal defying instinct, but as a being recognizing safety. That is the lesson many of us resist because it asks something uncomfortable of us. It asks us to admit that our smallest actions may matter far more than we realize. That kindness offered when no one is watching can take root and survive in ways we cannot predict. That time does not erase everything, especially not the feeling of being seen without judgment. For years, Margaret believed her volunteer work had been insignificant. A few quiet hours, a voice reading aloud, no dramatic rescue, no visible result. Like many of us, she carried the quiet doubt that our gentlest efforts are too small to leave a mark. This story proves otherwise. It reminds us that compassion does not always announce itself with applause. Sometimes it waits silently for decades, only to reappear when it is needed most. There is another lesson here, one that challenges how we see the world we share. We often draw firm lines between human emotion and animal instinct, between memory and reaction, between intelligence and feeling. But moments like this blur those lines, not to romanticize animals or diminish science, but to expand our humility. Atlas did not forgive in a human sense. He did not reason or rationalize, but he recognized something that had once made the world feel less dangerous. And when that recognition returned, he chose restraint. In a world obsessed with control and dominance, restraint is the rarest form of strength. Margaret's courage was not loud. It did not come from certainty. It came from trust in a feeling she could not fully explain, trust in the belief that fear does not always deserve the final word. She stood still, not because she was fearless, but because she understood something many of us forget. Panic escalates danger, while calm invites understanding. Together, their encounter offers a message that extends far beyond this single moment. It tells us that how we show up matters, that the energy we bring into a space, our tone, our patience, our willingness to listen, can change outcomes we assume are inevitable. That even in a world filled with noise, beings are always listening more closely than we think. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that healing does not always look like fixing. Sometimes healing looks like remembering who we were when we chose kindness, remembering that gentleness is not weakness, remembering that every life we touch carries our imprint long after we've moved on. This is why stories like this endure, not because they shock us, but because they awaken something we already know deep down, but too often ignore. If this story moved you, if it made you pause, reflect, or see the world a little differently, then you already understand why we tell these stories. They remind us of who we can be. If you believe in stories that reveal compassion where fear is expected, that honor quiet courage and the unseen power of kindness, then I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to keep sharing stories that matter, stories that heal, inspire, and reconnect us with the best parts of ourselves. Because sometimes the most powerful change begins not with action, but with presence.